Hi, this is Paul. A couple of good YouTubes dropped last couple of days. John Vervaeke did a question and answer video. He hadn't done one of those before, and it's worth watching. And Jonathan Pageau is trying to help everybody understand what he knows and is kind of at the center of his project, which is about symbolism and the way that symbolism relates to history. And that's a really important topic and a very difficult one for us to get a handle on. Now, the Peugeot brothers, in fact, have been all about patterns. And when we say the word pattern, we all assume we know what we mean by the word pattern. But patterns almost always involve some sort of predictable repetition. It's usually not perfect repetition, but when you think about sound, or you think about music, which is repetition by sound, and imagery, which has repetition, and history, which doesn't repeat itself but supposedly rhymes, you get the sense of patterns. And part of the reason we are so intuitive about patterns is that we need patterns. We're dependent upon predictable patterns in order to live. You get into John Vervaeke's cognitive psychology, and he talks about shamans employing psychotechnology to discern patterns. Now, part of the reason that we need patterns, even if you're in the hunter-gatherer, you have to discern the patterns of the herd migration. You have to discern the patterns of the changing season. You have to discern the patterns of when the trees and the bushes bear fruit. You have to discern the patterns that are in nature that will help you hunt and fish. In fact, survival is very much dependent upon discerning patterns, and so we are amazing pattern discerners as human beings. We're always looking for patterns. In fact, we are so in tune with patterns, we sometimes find patterns where there isn't a pattern existing. That's part of what human beings are about. And so you can very much see that this pattern recognition is vital for what it means to be a human being, what it means to survive. And so we're always looking for patterns. But here's the thing. Once we find a pattern, we tend to stick with that pattern, and we work with that pattern, and we keep using that pattern until something tells us the pattern is no longer working, and then we look for other patterns. So we survive in this world by discerning patterns and structuring our lives around them. Rhythm replaces strength is a handy little saying. Well, what do I mean by that? When you first learned to ride a bike, it required a whole lot of paying attention to all of your limbs, and then you learn to crank the wheels, and off you go. When you first learned to drive, it was a tremendous amount of looking around and trying to figure out everything until the other part of your brain took in the patterns and the rhythms, and once you internalize the pattern, well, now you can carry on a conversation and play with your cell phone and change the radio station and think about all kinds of things while you're driving, because other parts of your brain have so internalized the patterns that you can keep going. And that's why, in fact, texting while driving is so difficult, because you're assuming the patterns continue, and you turn off the machinery that is supposed to look for changes in the patterns. And so that car that stopped short right ahead of you, a change in the pattern that you weren't aware of, the pattern part of your brain doesn't know that, and so you slam into that car. But generally speaking, rhythm replaces strength. And once you've internalized the patterns, what you do then is you map those patterns onto yourself, and your motivational structure and what you do with your body and with your decisions especially assumes those patterns that you have integrated. And now your rhythms, once you start doing patterns, however, your rhythms mask other rhythms. Your rhythms bind and blind. Once you are in a certain routine and that routine has worked for you, you tend to stick in that routine. And as a pastor dealing with families and individuals, people get into their routines, and if something in the environment changes that requires them to adjust their routine, people don't like it. People want the routines to stay the same, at least the routines that have worked for them. So let's say you're a spouse, and generally speaking, every time you yell at your partner, you get the desired results. You will keep yelling at your partner until your partner changes the script and forces you. Or maybe you're sitting in the marriage counselor, and the marriage counselor says, don't yell at your partner. Say, wait a minute, that's my rhythm. My rhythm is yelling at my partner, and then I get the actions that I want. until the partner then steps out of the relationship or steps out of the situation, and now you have to learn a new pattern. But that's a whole bunch of work, and we don't like doing that. So we take patterns in and we map them and we internalize them, and this is in fact how we learn in the world. Now I'm going to play a couple of clips from Jordan Peterson, earlier clips. This one is from 2014, and he's talking about Piaget and mapping. And that's going to be important as we get further into these patterns as we go.
Disrupted. Now, there's a psychologist named Piaget. Some of you might know about him. Piaget was very interested in what happens to value structures and their hierarchical organization once they have to apply outside of the confines of a body. So here's a way of thinking about it. 2-year-olds basically hypothalamic. That's why they're so much fun. First they're happy, then they're sad, then they're hungry, then they're tired. You know, they just zip from one pretty straightforward and rather awe-inspiring motivational state to another.
Now a 2-year-old is an interesting example, because if you've ever had a 2-year-old, I've had 5 of them, you very quickly realize that the parents begin to develop and understand the patterns of their 2-year-old, and in fact anticipate their 2-year-old's needs. The 2-year-old is just living their life. They don't discern, well, actually they have internalized different patterns, and when things change in their environment, they complain, but they're not using patterns, they're not employing patterns so much to control their world. It's part of the developmental process that's going through. But their parents, very much, the wise parents, anticipate the patterns that the 2-year-old is expressing, adapt their context to that, and often do that in a way so that the 2-year-old begins to come into line with the patterns being imposed by the parents. Here's meal time, here's nap time, here's play time. These are some of the things we play with, these are some of the things they don't. The 2-year-old begins to learn the word no.
But at 2, they can't play. They can play by themselves, but they can't play with other children. They can't get that until they're 3. And they need to get it by the time they're 3, because if they don't get it by the time they're 4, they will never get it. And then you have an antisocial kid who's going to be an outsider for his entire life, and there isn't anything you can do about it. So that has to happen between 2 and 4. So what happens at about age 3 is that the kid learns how to play a game with another person. And what that game is fundamentally the development of the ability to share a frame of reference, which is what you're doing when you play Monopoly. It's like, it's stupid to play Monopoly, obviously. Who cares if you have a whole pile of counterfeit paper, right? But it doesn't matter, because the way you're constituted is that your brain will treat anything you act like constitutes a valuable goal as if it's a valid framework of reference. And if it couldn't do that, A, you couldn't abstract, and B, you could not get along with other people. So you can sit around the table and you can say, let's pretend that Monopoly is a reasonable facsimile of reality, which you wouldn't say, but it's what you mean. And everybody says, yes, that would be amusing. And so then you set your goal, which is to get all the little hotels and all the money, and poof, your emotions go along for the ride. And what's so interesting about that is you can get everybody into the game. And so one of the things that's really interesting about people is that we can establish a shared fictional frame of reference, and it organizes all our emotions so they're predictable.
Remember, a fictional frame of reference, and that's really important in here, okay? It's a fictional frame of reference that we all adopt in order to play this game of Monopoly. And part of why we see the value of Monopoly is because there seem to be patterns here that both relate to life, and then maybe, you know, there's something that can be gained by playing this game together.
That's also why we can watch movies. You go to a movie, you identify the hero, you figure out what the hero wants, poof, you're the hero. And the way that works is, you don't look at the hero and think about what he's doing and evaluate it emotionally and then feel it. What you do is you specify the hero's goal, and then you map him onto your body, and you read off the emotional responses of your own body, and that's how you understand the hero.
Okay. Now that mapping thing is really critical here, because what we do when we see a movie and we map this other hero onto us is we actually are playing around with in this fictional game within this frame of reference. We are adding a little bit of fictional chaos to the order that we live within. And the order may or may not be working real well for us, but as we're going to see in the next Piaget clip from Maps of Meaning 2015, this is important for us. Now chaos plus logos becomes order. But your order binds and blinds. You work within your order for a while, but you continue to iterate that order. And what happens in the movie when you map on the hero and you map on this other story that's out there, it's a little shamanic practice in a sense. In that you are trying to see the world through different eyes, and this is what literature does. You want your order disrupted enough, usually through chaos, to taste other patterns. Now, if you're doing this in the comfort of a movie theater, that's very easy because there's all this order in the movie theater. And actually when so a friend of mine planted a church in a movie theater once, and I could understand why there were some advantages for planting his church in the movie theater, but there were some huge disadvantages too. Because in fact, when the architects and designers design a movie theater, they have this one situation in mind. The sound dampening is built into the place. You're made, the rows are all like this, so you can't really talk to one another easily. The lights are all down low because you're not supposed to see each other. In fact, there's an entire frame of reference that's built into the movie theater that is exactly designed and communicated to the public for seeing movies. And whereas you had lots of chairs and you had a stage, you can kind of use it for a church, but there's some real downsides to trying to use a movie theater for a church. But what's important here are the patterns, and so there's pattern built into the movie theater. There's liturgies. This is from Jamie Smith's books on Desiring the Kingdom. His talk about secular liturgies. There's liturgies in terms of the movie theater. There's liturgies built into the architecture. There's liturgies built into the chairs. There's liturgies built into exactly what you're supposed to do in a movie theater. At the beginning of the movie, there's all of this liturgical training, this catechesis that the movie theater is doing for you. Turn off your cell phones. Don't talk to one another. This is all reinforced and built in, but then you see the hero. So you have a very safe space in the movie theater where everything's supposed to be quiet and dark. And in fact, you're not looking at other human beings. You're all by yourself. And you're supposed to interact with the hero. And what you do is you map that hero onto you. And in the little 2 hours of chaos, you are disrupting your patterns through your mental fiction, and you're trying on other things. And at the end of the movie, you leave. And then sometimes maybe you'll go out to eat with your friends and you'll talk about, well, what did you learn from the movie? And what's happening in our mind is we want to keep our order for the most part, but we want to add a little bit of chaos, a little bit of new ideas. And as Peterson says in the other things, it's okay for our ideas to die. Better for our ideas to die than for us to die. And so you've got all of this mapping going on in the movie theater, and we've got these tiny little disruptions of the logos order we have placed on our lives because we are trying to adapt and refine and perfect and accommodate and grow a little bit more. Movies are not just about entertainment. They are in many ways the church services of our age. Now, a few weeks ago, PSA Sitch and Adam did one of their stream conversations on Owen Benjamin. And Owen Benjamin kept talking about Jordan Peterson's wizardry and the wizardry. And in many ways, Owen Benjamin has his own Alex Jones type wizardry going. And they were kind of mocking him in terms of the word wizardry. He's a wizard. Jordan Peterson is a wizard. Well, in many ways, Owen Benjamin has a point with that language, because what's happening is basically shamanic. And someone recently sent me an Owen Benjamin video, and I was listening to some of it, and I thought, yeah, he's really going out there in Alex Jones territory. But what I think part of the reason people listen to Alex Jones and Owen Benjamin is because they are introducing a little bit of chaos into their lives via the fiction, via the storytelling, and it's safe to just try out a little bit. You don't have to change your life listening to Owen Benjamin or Alex Jones. People say they're listening to it for entertainment purposes. Well, why do you find it entertainment? Because you're introducing just a little bit of chaos, a few different ways of looking at things. It's in fact very shamanic in the sense that John Vervaeke is talking about shamanism. In fact, stories are shamanic. Great literature basically works on you in the same way the movies does. If you're reading a really good book and it becomes engrossing, you get a little bit of flow state going. I couldn't put it down. It was a page turner. Well, what's happening is you are taking on that world and you are mapping it onto yourself. You're identifying with the hero or the protagonist or some other character in it, and you're trying out all of the little things going on in the story imaginatively in your mind. In fact, many of the places in your consciousness congress that doesn't have control of your mouth, that's what they're doing when you're reading great literature. Great literature, novels, movies, fairy tales, proverbs, wisdom literature. That's all that's happening. It's all these little disruptions in the order of your life in order to afford new growth and new chaos. So in a sense, all of these things allow us to see the world through different eyes, and they reveal patterns. And we look at these patterns, and then probably if we've looked at them enough and we have enough courage, we start to try them out on other people. We start to try new things. Now, young people are especially susceptible to these kinds of things, which is why you have all of the kids in high school and college who are all being terribly authentic by all doing exactly the same thing and all thinking the same way. They haven't yet lived long enough to differentiate, and in fact, when people get older, they differentiate more and more and more and more and more from other people. When they're young, they're just basically absorbing all of this stuff, internalizing all of it, and because they're not really well formed yet, they're grabbing on and they're mapping these new orders onto the chaos in their lives and trying them out. So now the Bible has been the most powerful and affirmed piece of literature in all of human history. John Calvin, in fact, calls the Bible glasses or eyeglasses or lenses through which we see the world. And I've made this point in a bunch of other videos that the Bible is the #1 read, commented on, translated, published, the most influential book in all of human history. Now, at some point, you have to ask yourself, why? Why has the Bible been so influential? Why can you take the Bible, translate it into a previously unknown language from some tiny tribal group in a jungle somewhere, and after you finish teaching them how to read their own language, hand them off the Bible and they will be able to do something practical with it? Almost any other book on your shelf, if you would do that for them, and nobody does, if you would do that for them, they probably wouldn't care at all for the book. But almost every culture finds something in the Bible, and this of course gets into Jordan Peterson's ideas about that. What has been coded in the Bible are these deep patterns that have been with us for a very, very long time. They've gotten coded into the Bible, and this is why the Bible continues to turn people's worlds upside down, even in a culture like ours that has, for the last number of years, basically told people that the Bible is a load of bunk. Often people I'm talking to who have been atheists start reading the Bible and are amazed by what they find in it. Well, what is the Bible doing? The Bible is in a sense acting like this shamanic story that is disrupting the patterns that they know and showing them new patterns. In fact, if you read Jesus talks in parables. Well, why parables? Well, these stories, parables, often the ones that Jesus tells, are very disruptive. Many of the last will be first, and many of the first will be last. Well, there's a strange thing. And all of these parables are designed, in fact, to disrupt us, to break us out of the rigid orders that we have developed and invite us into a new type of order. In fact, much of the change that happens, one of the big things I've learned in the Jordan Peterson thing, which I should have known better as a pastor, is that we all imagine we work in a very straightforward, rational manner, and people don't really work that way. We all imagine that we turn rationality into words, and then you hear it, and then you consider it in your rational mind, and you do it. But just as Jordan Peterson mentioned, that's not how people work at all. In fact, you're always listening, and parts of your brain are always processing, and so parts of you who are pretty happy with the order that you have established. But if you hear something, we listen for opportunities and threats. If you hear something that might seem to offer an improvement on the order that you've settled on, well, you might try that out, and you might think about it, and you might play around with it in a small way. And this is actually part of the process of conversion. So what actually we do with great literature, and even with bad literature and movies and fairy tales and proverbs, and especially the Bible, is that these things act as shamanic disruptors in our lives, and they both disrupt the patterns that we have and show us some new patterns and offer us different patterns than necessarily the pattern that we've been working out in our individual life, in our family life, in our culture, and so on and so forth. Now, as Jordan Peterson notes many times, what we really see are opportunities and threats, because patterns are by their nature repetitive, and because we are deeply motivated to try to navigate today with an eye to the future. That tends to remember John Vervaeke's autobiographical story that goes on and on and on. We're always bent towards the future. And even when we're talking about this crazy ride that Jordan Peterson is on, how will it end? Can he really survive on a diet of beef, salt, and water? Is that possible? Will at some point, as he keeps doing the book tour, will people stop showing up? Will he feel the downward bend in his arc in time to figure out a new way to start a new arc? I mean, there's all these interesting things that go around about him. People are deeply motivated to try to navigate today with an eye to the future. We try to discern the patterns to make choices in this forum for action. And so, in fact, that's what the shaman does. The tribe is basically working out one pattern. That's their normal pattern that they work out. The shaman comes in and says, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And remember, I talked about the mesh network, and these messages go back and forth, and then maybe a few over here start thinking that this new alternative idea is better, and they try it out, and everybody's watching if this new way tries it out. In fact, we're doing this all the time as a society. If you look at some of the ways, now we've had tremendous disruption via technology in our societies over the last 100 years. Tremendous disruption via technology in terms of the regular patterns of people's lives. And so then what we start doing is continue to adopt. We see high rates of change. We're always looking at new patterns. And so then we're watching communities that try them. And it's actually a very good thing that we have conservative communities and conservative religious communities around, because what those allow us to do is look at, okay, the early adopters are all trying this stuff. Well, we can just watch them to see how that works. And if it shows promise, well, maybe we'll put more resources over there. If it looks like a bad idea, well, maybe we'll pull back. And we've got these kinds of things going on currently at a massive level, and the world has never been as interconnected as it is now, especially in terms of information. And so we're all watching these patterns. But we're always attuned towards opportunities and threats. And so when we see his pattern working, we say, ooh, that looks like an opportunity. I'm going to go there. We see people doing this and say, ooh, wow, that looks like a bad thing. Let's pull back. And we've got this constantly going on around us. Now, we are motivated to seek out patterns, and our lives, not just our physical lives, but our reputational lives, our future, they all depend on it. And so then we look at these patterns in history. Now, this is where Jonathan Pageau is really struggling to have his audience understand what he means. Patterns are disconnected from physical history, are downgraded in our hierarchies. Okay, when in a sense the flat earth was downgraded by the moon landing, well, then everybody who's a flat earther has to say, well, the moon landing was a hoax. So you have these competing patterns. That's one way to understand the competing stories that are going on. So you've got flat earthers versus round earthers. And I saw in the comment section someone began to wonder if I was a flat earther by a comment I made to Preston Sprinkle. I'm flying to Australia. I think we're going to be going around a ball, but I may be wrong. I'll leave I'm high in openness, which means, oh, you're a flat earther. Let me hear your argument. But patterns are when patterns get disconnected from physical history, they get downgraded in our hierarchy. We're always, again, looking for utility. We're always looking for opportunities and threats. But when someone says, well, paying someone a whole lot of money to say that my daughter is a star athlete can get her into Harvard, oops, there was a sting. Well, then suddenly the bottom falls out in the market of paying for fraud to get into Harvard. And we're always looking at these patterns. But again, because, again, go back to the hunter-gatherers and then the agricultural revolution. If you go back there and you say, okay, the patterns got repeated in the population and gained prevalence in the population because they were connected with history, because they were connected with how life works. And so we're little pragmatists, and we're always trying to figure this out. But that's difficult because we all know that living right in the moment, people say, well, live in the moment. Well, nobody lives in the moment like a homeless drug addict. Homeless drug addicts live in the moment. One homeless drug addict I knew found a bag, and in this bag was a needle and a whole bunch of little balls, and he thought, oh, good, tar heroin. He injected it into his arm. Well, what he didn't know, he's just injected dirt into his arm. His arm got all infected, and he had to go to the hospital to get the whole thing cleaned out. Well, that was living in the moment. See, opportunity. Look, there's an opportunity. Now, there are other patterns out there, one of which might have said, well, no real, nobody's probably going to leave their heroin stash just laying out here on the street for you to find it. So maybe it would be not a good idea to just pick it up and inject it in your arm. But a homeless heroin addict, pretty much lives in the moment, sees threats and opportunities, acts on it immediately. So we pick up these patterns, which are always longer-term patterns and short-term patterns. And as I've mentioned before, religions are very long-term patterns. Religions are ways for our ancestors to have a voice in the decision-making that we make today. And this is why there's often a spectrum of religions. There's religions that change very slowly. There are religions that change very quickly, and they're always watching each other. Especially the slow adopters are watching the early adopters and saying, how's that working out for them? Well, let's wait 100 years and see. Now, most Americans aren't waiting 100 years to see anything because their we is only maybe 70 or 80 years or only 2 or 3 generations. But if they identify with a principality, which is a religious group, their we might be 2,000 years. And again, as I've said many times, whenever you listen to people using the word we, who do they mean? Well, we had nervous systems before there were trees. Well, who is we? Now you're identifying with creatures with nervous systems that are along some biological path of succession. Well, we fought the Germans and won. Well, who is we? Did you go over to Germany during World War II, during World War I? Oh, you're identifying nationalistically. Well, we will survive. Well, what if we surviving means that my consciousness is somehow uploaded into some server where that consciousness, I suppose, is, again, the stuff just gets crazy. But again, you have to answer the question, who is we? So we're very invested in patterns being connected to history. And so when Jonathan Pageau, when he's using symbolism, that's very much like patterns. And so there's a mapping onto history, but as Jonathan noted, that mapping on might not be the same kind of mapping on that the way that you and I would do it, partly because other other cultures represent history in different ways. And in fact, you don't have to go back 2,000 years to, let's say, the writing of the New Testament to see this. You can read a newspaper that's 100 years old and see and already begin to see the different senses of representation that different cultures do. You can go, in fact, hop on a plane and go to another culture in the world. You might not even have to hop on a plane. You might have to just go to a different neighborhood and talk to someone who grew up in a different place than you, and you can begin to see that their mappings are a little bit different than yours, but they do map onto history and they map onto culture. And all of that is part of language and representation in the world. Now, what Jonathan and his brother Matthew keep trying to do is say, these are the patterns that we see in the Bible. And I was complaining not too long ago when I was in the Gospel of Mark that some of these newer translations would render the sea in Greek as a lake. And that annoyed me because no, it's a sea, because you have the Sea of Galilee and you have the Great Sea and you have the Cosmic Sea. And the writer is in fact using these symbolisms to attach what Jesus is doing with his disciples, who are catchers of people. When we say fishers, we're already leaning into fish and not people. The Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is important. These pigs rushing down into the sea because the demon legion goes into them. That's highly symbolic all the way around, but because we're not terribly attuned to that symbolism, we tend to miss it. Jonathan Pageau, being an artist, he's very attuned to symbolism. In fact, his job is representing symbolism in visual form. He's very much attuned to it. But the point he kept making in his Symbolism Matters is that the connection between these patterns and history is vitally important to us and has always been. Now, presentation must also be shamanic or symbolic. In other words, part of the reason that we opt for symbolism is because we want the patterns to continue, but we want it to be a disrupted pattern. In other words, one of the things that Peterson says when he does the biblical lectures is he wants everything that he says to be applicable to his audience. That's a value that he has. But you might think, well, how is Genesis applicable? And part of the success of the biblical series for Peterson was that people with little or no Bible knowledge listened to him and found his message applicable. And that's that mapping of stuff onto history. It's also shamanic in that it's a little bit disruptive of your pattern. That's the newness of it that comes to us. That's when you listen to a message or you see a movie or you listen to a sermon and you say, aha, I can use that. I'm going to disrupt my normal pattern and I'm going to add a new pattern on it. Now, part of the way that the Bible does this is say that, well, history is never quite the same. You might look at King David and say, well, I hardly face the kinds of challenges he did. But via the symbolism, via the pattern, there might be something you can use from the story. Now, again, to our detriment, often we read the stories simplistically, and this is partly the fault of a lot of bad Sunday school material that's been written over the years that tries to make the biblical characters examples, positive examples, when often they're negative examples, and it's in the mixture that we begin to understand what from David should we be able to take out that I can apply to my life, what in that hero should map onto me, and I can begin to disrupt the patterns that I have and adjust those patterns with a new understanding. And actually, the Christian Reformed Church dealt with this in the 1970s and came up with a phrase which I have found very helpful. That's the event character. And what that means is that in Genesis, you will have a story, and that what connects that story is told symbolically, but there's event character that's linked to that story. If the story is, in a sense, just stories made up, pure fiction, well, there are parables in the Bible. There are completely fictional stories in the Bible. Well, those might be helpful, just like seeing a movie is helpful, but almost every time you see a movie that is in some way based on a true story, the movie will almost always tell you why. That has a certain salience to it. You won't see that at the beginning of the Avengers movie, and people will watch the Avengers movie or Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, and they'll say, "Ooh, I'm learning from that. I'm learning from those patterns." But when it's based on a true story, well, then suddenly we say that pattern has more salience because the pattern has actually been validated in history. And that's what the Christian Reformed Church Report 44 from, I think it was 74 or 75, that's what it was talking about, that the Bible, the biblical stories they're told in a certain representation within the culture of its day, but there's an event character that holds through. Now, what the Bible is actually about, again, is the reunion of heaven and earth. And so, again, if you listen to Vervaeke, he'll bring you up to speed on this axial age stuff. And this is an axial age achievement. The axial revolution offered a different story that said, okay, we've got all of this mess down here at Earth. On Earth, everything decays, people die, everywhere is suffering. People don't behave as they should. So you kind of have a flip side, which is heaven, where, well, that's where everything is as it should be. And so in a sense, you have chaos below and order above. And even in Jesus, in the Lord's Prayer, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus prays, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And so you get this whole relationship between heaven and earth in the axial age. And this runs through the Bible. The Bible is actually the story of the Bible begins with the separation of heaven and earth. That's the man and the woman being kicked out of the garden. And then in the book of Revelation, you have the reconciliation of heaven and earth. But many cultures were dealing with this. And they're dealing with the question of how to defeat death, because down here on earth, you have death and suffering. Up there in heaven, you don't have death and suffering. So how did the Greeks defeat death? Well, you become a story. You become a famous story. You become a heroic story, a story that can live on for years. So we still know who Achilles is, and we still know who Hector is, and we still know who Odysseus is. And when we watch the hero, we map that hero onto ourselves and we try them out. So Hector is trying to defend Troy, and he's a valiant warrior, but his story is ultimately tragic. Many of the Greek stories are, in fact, tragic. Achilles is this amazing warrior who's going to, in fact, overcome Troy, but he's got, of course, his famous Achilles heel, which that's where he will be wounded, and that's where he will die. And you have Odysseus, who is going to challenge the gods and be a schemer and find his way and best everyone. But his story is and isn't happy. Okay? So we map these heroes onto us. These act shamanically, and they tend to inform us to give us new patterns, which through fiction we map them onto our present patterns and we try them out. That's what these things do. And so for the Greeks, the idea was, well, your body isn't going to survive death, but if you, in fact, are a story, you can live on through your stories. So every time I mention Hector or Achilles or Hercules or Odysseus, they win. They live on through their story. But when you say that to an American, you're like, that's not really living on. Hector and Odysseus and Achilles, they're not living the story in the way a human being is living the story. So in the Old Testament, the Hebrews have your children embody your story. So what you basically do is you map yourself onto your children. Read the book of Deuteronomy. Train your children. Train your children. The worst thing that could happen to you in the Old Testament was for you to lose, to have your children die, and to have no heirs and to be cut off. That was, in a sense, damnation. because your future is through your children. Now, when it comes to Jesus, Jesus is interesting because Jesus has no children. And in fact, when you look at the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts, the Ethiopian eunuch through Jesus has hope. Well, Jesus has no children, but Jesus is raised from the dead. And so with Jesus, you who are an embodied story won't end in death. God raises Jesus from the dead, and after his resurrection, unlike Lazarus, he doesn't die. He ascends into heaven. And he's there until he returns again. And when he returns again, he brings heaven down to earth. And that essentially is what the book of Revelation talks about. But when heaven comes down to earth, something's going to have to give to the degree that the earth is, now we're getting into eschatology, to the degree that the earth is not ready to receive heaven. And then you're going to have a conflict. Now, as John Vervaeke is working his way through his, it's going to be 50. It's going to be 50. I was really happy to hear that because, hey, one every week. I can deal with that, although he's already got 25 in the can. So it'll be interesting to see what the next ones look like, because part of what's fun about this internet learning community is kind of the live ways that we learn. I mean, I just saw this video from John Vervaeke, saw this video from Jonathan Pageau, and here a couple days later, I can do a video in response, and we can actually get a conversation going back and forth, and that's a really cool thing. We've got this meaning crisis. Well, what causes this meaning crisis? The secular age casts doubt on the actual age's solution to death. If you look at N.T. Wright's Gifford lectures, you'll notice that N.T. Wright sees an Epicurean revival, and saying that basically we just keep retooling Epicurean philosophy. Now, the other thing that N.T. Wright is always complaining about is Gnosticism. Well, you can understand that with the billboard that comes up every year in Sacramento, where you've got some atheist who says, I don't need a God to give me meaning and wonder. I make it myself. And you're like, oh, okay. But that doesn't really address the solution of death, because when you die, well, atheists really don't give the best funerals. And what was I listening to the other day that basically an atheist was kind of fessing up to that? Because when you go to a funeral with an atheist, well, at least these other people are saying, well, they're going somewhere. There's at least some way in which the story continues, and about the best you can do is, well, they live on in your heart. Well, that's kind of like the Greeks, but unless you're at the funeral for Hector or Achilles or Odysseus, who have done great things, great heroic things, well, he was a schlub, and he lives on in our heart, and we remember not only some of the good things he did, but why he drank too much and cheated on his wife and, did all those other lousy things. They make their own meaning and wonder via willpower or material accomplishment, but then cue, for example, the book of Ecclesiastes. Now I want to play a little bit of Peterson's 2015 personality. Oh, it's in his personality course, Lecture 5 on Piaget, because it's interesting how Piaget comes into this.
And so, again, I'm going to repeat that. So the animal's problem is how to fulfill a motivational state, we'll say. Your problem is how to fulfill multiple motivational states in a social environment that's composed of many other people doing the same thing in the short term, the medium term, and the long term.
That's a lot of patterns to manage.
And you want to come up with a solution that will satisfy all those constraints.
So you've got all of these constraints from the environment, and you've got the time frame constraints, and you've got the population constraints, and this is where we're going to get into Piaget's equilibrated state.
Simultaneously. Now, Piaget would regard a solution like that as an equilibrated state. An equilibrated state is a solution that isn't producing anomalies or novelties when it's enacted in the world.
Okay, so now we're talking patterns and how patterns map onto the physical world and how they map onto history. Because now remember, well, what is history? Positivists especially now Vervaeke talked physical. I was really happy when Vervaeke talked about physicalists. We tend to, our cultural bias is to lean towards objects in space. And so when we ask what really happened, we're usually trying to map physical objects and people. And that's a really important thing. That has to be part of the mapping. But the meaning is almost never in the bare physical objects. And this is where when Peterson is talking to Sam Harris and they're talking about Elton John's glass, the value of it having been Elton John's glass or Elvis's guitar is not actually in the object itself. Now you might say, well, it's in the arrangement of the objects. Well, that's true, but that's just the point. It's in the relationship between all the objects and the history, and it's really captured at the meaning level. And so in a sense, the patterns, what makes Elvis's guitar so valuable is Elvis's high status. The patterns get mapped onto the guitar. And so what you're looking for in equilibrated state is, well, what happens? Well, we'll let him talk about it.
And so it's important to understand this because it forms part of the Piagetian theory of morality. Now, Piaget, he was a kind of a strange guy. He was a childhood prodigy. He was studying animals in depth when he was a small child. He published his first scientific paper when he was 10, which was on the behavior of mollusks. And the next year he was offered the curatorship of a museum in Switzerland. But his parents, given his developmental stage, had to tell the people who wanted him to take over the curatorship that he was only 11 and that it probably wouldn't be appropriate. Now, when Piaget was an adolescent, he went through what you might describe as a messianic crisis. He actually regarded messianism as a developmental stage that often characterized late adolescence. And so at that stage, people are concerned with the relationship between their individual lives and the broader social community. And when he was in that messianistic stage and very much concerned about morality, he was also suffering from the tension between scientific and religious points of view. And one of the things that he wanted to do as an adult was to reconcile values with science, or more broadly speaking, religion with science, but we'll stick to values and morality with science. And I think he...
Now, it's helpful here when you look at the values in science. I mean, science is traditionally connected with this physical layer. And the values are the things that get mapped on. So we look for the patterns in science, but the patterns in science have meaning because of the storyverse, this other thing that gets mapped onto it.
Got farther along on that than anyone else has, and the equilibrated state is one of his most intelligent propositions. So an equilibrated state would be something like, it could be two things. It could be you in a happy family, and it could be the happy family. It depends on your level of analysis. But you in a happy family are going to be equilibrated because, assuming that you're as happy as the rest of the family, what that means is that you found a mode of operation that simultaneously works for you and for your family. And a higher order equilibrated state would be happy you in a happy family in a happy city, let's say. And so there are multiple levels of potential equilibration.
Now it's this, that I often talk about the equilibrated state, and this is what he's talking about. It's all of these, it's this thing that scales out. It's this manner of being, this way of being that works. It's, in a sense, not too far from the Hebraic conception of shalom, which is often translated as peace in English.
And one of Piaget's fundamental claims was that an equilibrated state was preferable, so there's a value judgment there, to a disequilibrated state. And the reason for that was that it took less energy per unit of work to maintain an equilibrated state. So think about it this way. So there's family A and there's family B, and they're competing in a local environment. And family B is very disharmonious. And so in order for the family to get anything done, or any of the individuals within the family, there has to be a tremendous amount of conflict. And so the load is whatever they have to do, plus the conflict they have to go through in order to do it. And in many cases, if the situation is disequilibrated enough, then the conflict that you have to go through to do whatever it is that you want to do actually requires more energy than the thing itself. And so Piaget's point was then, whereas in a happy family, we'll say, an equilibrated family, both the individuals and the family as a unit can move forward without wasting a lot of time in conflict. And so Piaget's idea was that, you know, in a race for success, however you happen to define success, the equilibrated system is going to outperform the disequilibrated system, because the disequilibrated system has to waste time and energy on enforcement.
And if you're looking for a Jesus saying, a house divided cannot stand. The other house wins. And this also could map onto the idea of in shalom, which is life in heaven, there is no conflict. And so on one hand, heaven wins, and on the other hand, heaven has no cops, because it's an equilibrated state.
That's a lovely idea. It's a profound idea, because what it does is it sets up the preconditions for starting to understand how value judgments, so to speak, and value judgments are outcroppings of theories of action, because a theory of action has to do with what you should do, and that's a value judgment. Piaget would say that the patterns of action and the value judgments that lead towards a more thoroughly equilibrated state are better. Now, you can take that a bit further, and you can say that, and this is sort of akin to Piaget's ideas, that children go through stages of development that are somewhat identifiable across cultures, although there's a fair bit of debate about that. It's a quasi-Piagetian notion that there only might be a finite number of equilibrated solutions to a set of given problems. So you can imagine, well, you pop up on the horizon, you're born, and you're a particular kind of entity. Now, there are some things that you can do as an entity to continue your existence as an entity, and there's other things that you can't do, so you're bounded by a set of limitations and possibilities. One of the limitations seems to be is that your family has to be sufficiently well integrated so that you get a certain amount of attention. So, for example, if babies don't get a certain amount of physical attention in the first year of their life, so nobody literally touches them and plays with them, then they'll often die because their gastrointestinal systems will shut down. And even if they don't die, they're so impaired afterwards as a consequence of that lack of initial stimulation that they never recover. And so you can see right off the bat that one of the preconditions for, even for existence as a human being, is that you have to be born into a familial environment that has certain structures in place. Now, some of them are obvious, like, well, you should be fed, and you have to be fed what you need to be fed, and you have to be protected and sheltered.
And you can see that these patterns, these are not human constructs. These are not patterns that we make up. These are patterns that we discern, and these are patterns that we map onto ourselves. And, you know, here we're in, you know, in the 20th century, they discovered that pattern, and we had been living out these patterns for years. And in fact, we couldn't articulate them, but we lived them out because we survived, and the patterns continued to flourish in communities where the flourishing was rewarded by more flourishing.
And you know, you have to be exposed to a certain amount of information flow and so on. So your obvious physical needs have to be taken care of, but then there are less obvious things that you need from your local environment, like physical attention, literally touch, and play, and social interaction, and language, because if any of those are lacking in the initial developmental stages, depends on the stage, then you're going to be so crippled that you won't be able to survive and thrive in the world. So then you can think that, you know, imagine that there's a set of constraints that define the system within which you can thrive as an individual. Then you might say, well, there's a set of constraints within which a family can survive as a family without blowing apart. And then if you put multiple families together in some sort of community, there's a set of constraints that have to be met for those families to live together in relative harmony, and so on, all the way up the levels of complexity. And a properly equilibrated state, as I said, would be one where you're thriving in a thriving family, in a thriving community, and so forth, all the way up the chain of complexity. So it's a very, very, very smart idea. And you can also imagine that one of the things that that means is that representations of moral systems might have some similarities across cultures. Now we know this is true already because there are a number of human universals.
And C.S. Lewis's, again, The Abolition of Man is the Tao, as he calls it.
But if you take individuals and you put them in geographical area A and you take different individuals and you put them in geographical area B, because of the nature of the constraints and the fact that there's some relatively limited subset of solutions that will satisfy everyone at each of those levels of analysis, you're going to expect relatively similar moral systems to develop in different cultures. And so it's also a powerful argument against moral relativism. Now, relativism is a tricky thing because, you can ask yourself, well, are people the same or are they different? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on what you mean when you ask the question. And I'm not being sarcastic about that. That question is not answerable without some additional information about what you're up to, because it's like saying, well, are human languages the same or different? And the answer is, well, they're the same and different. There are levels of analysis at which they're the same, and there are levels of analysis at which they're different. And whether you consider the levels of analysis with the similarities more important than the levels of analysis with the differences is going to depend on what you want as a consequence of asking the question. So, but we do know that there are broad and identifiable similarities across people that don't seem to be merely biological. They're also biological and cultural. And, you can see examples of that pretty quickly by the fact that, I think there are going to be more smartphones in the world next year than there are people. And so it's pretty obvious that there's a universal market for smartphones, and that says something about, the makeup of people themselves, regardless of culture. Because people find tools that facilitate social communication desirable, and they find tools that facilitate information gathering desirable. And they don't have to be taught to desire that. They are just like that. So, anyway, like I said, Piaget is a good antidote to moral relativism, because the idea that it's like this. Think about it this way, because this is another way to understand it. I'll give you two examples. There were multiplayer online games in the early stages of multiplayer online games that collapsed into anarchy. And then they had to be shut down. And the reason for that was that they weren't playable games. There was some flaw in their underlying set of assumptions that made them unsustainable as a meeting place for multiple human beings across large periods of time. Others are more equilibrated, and people will play them. And so you can also think about a game as an equilibrated state, for example. And Piaget is quite smart about this sort of thing. So let's say a Monopoly game. Well, is it an equilibrated state? Well, the answer to that is yes, insofar as all the players finish the game. And then you might say, well, all the players finish the game and they're still friends. Because that would be another level of specification or constraint that you could put on it. But it's also interesting if you consider something like an enjoyable game as an equilibrated state, that you can have competition within an equilibrated state, a social community, with no problem, as long as everybody agrees on what the rules for the competition are. And so Piaget actually regarded competition as a necessary element of games, because he said that a game, it's so interesting. He actually thought of competition in some sense as necessarily tied in with cooperation. So here's an example. Take a hockey game. So then we could say, well, are people playing hockey, are they competing or are they cooperating? And the answer to that is, well, it's pretty hard to distinguish, because all the players within a given team are cooperating insofar as they're a given team. And what that means is that each player is trying to climb the hierarchy of competence within the team, but at the same time maximizing the probability that the team will be successful across multiple games. And so that means that there's a set of constraints around how that player has to interact with his teammates, right? He has to work in a manner that enables the development of his teammates, because otherwise it's like a psychopathic strategy. It's a bad long-term strategy. And then you might say, okay, fine, people are cooperating within the team, but what about between teams? And then the answer to that is, well, they're cooperating insofar as they follow the rules, and that they don't bring a basketball to the hockey game or a chess set to the hockey game, because obviously you can't play chess and hockey at the same time, and so everybody's agreed to act out a certain set of behavioral constraints, and insofar as they're doing that, that's a cooperative maneuver. So that's pretty interesting too. Piaget actually believed that children couldn't become social until, so at their earliest stages of development, as far as Piaget was concerned, children in some sense were playing by themselves. And the reason they're doing that is because they're not very organized yet. Their bodies are sort of not completely under their control. So you could think of a child as a non-equilibrated set of quasi-functional and quasi-unified knowledge subsystems. So, for example, when a child is born and they're laying on their back, their arms are kind of floating around like this. And the reason for that is their arms aren't myelinated yet. The baby's kind of myelinated from a nervous system perspective in the center of its body, and its mouth is pretty wired up. But the rest of it isn't very formed, and so what the child has to do is integrate him or herself as an individual entity and bring all those subsystems online and into something that's sort of integrated across reasonable lengths of time. And then the next goal is to do that with someone else, and that's about 3 years old when social play starts. So then if you and I are playing and we're playing, say, pretend play, we're going to say, well, we're going to do X, you know, we'll lay out the ground rules, we're going to do X, and we can compete to get towards X. But if we couldn't have unified our goals, so unified these frames of reference, we wouldn't be able to compete in the same space. And so one of the things Piaget is pointing out is that it's clearly the case that a competitive game can facilitate cooperation, and in fact, the establishment of such games might actually be absolutely fundamental to socialization itself. So,
just to backtrack, because that was a long clip, the axial age is, in a sense, the separation of heaven and earth. Heaven is, let's call it axial age technology, by which we can understand that the world doesn't have to be the way the world is around us. Okay. Now in framing it this way, I am not in any way undercutting the idea of divine revelation. I'm telling it from a perspective from below. You can understand why, well, when we look around and say, look, everybody dies, we kill each other, people are bad actors, people are immoral. Well, let's flip it upside down and imagine a place where nobody dies, where everyone is moral, where you actually have your equilibrated state, where you no longer need police or law or judgment or punishment or all of these things just to keep order, because once you know this, you can imagine a world without it. Okay? So then you have the axial age, you have the separation of heaven and earth. And in fact, again, the Bible begins in the book of Genesis. You have the creation of the temple in Genesis 1. You have, in a sense, the backyard or the patio or the royal gardens in Genesis 2. And the man and the woman are gardeners. And then the man and the woman are kicked out of the garden as they rebel. And in fact, there's an angel with a flaming sword that keeps them out of the garden. And that's the division of heaven and earth. And what you see is that so they have two children. They have Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel kill each other, and you continue to go into Genesis 5, and people become more and more violent. The whole system breaks down, and so then God basically flushes it, except for Noah. And he keeps Noah, and he preserves Noah, the best man in the world, and his family, and preserves them. But then the story goes bad again. Noah plants a vineyard. Noah gets drunk on the wine. His son laughs at him. Noah curses his son. Everyone stays together at Babel, even though God said, spread out amongst the world. Everyone stays together at Babel, and they're constructing a ladder up to heaven. Why? In order to invade heaven, and the contagion is going to spread all the way to heaven, and God says, no, not so fast, and confuses the languages, and the tower goes away. And then God has a problem. Now he can kill everybody in the world. He's done that, but that didn't help because you'd have to kill absolutely everyone. And so how can God, in fact, have the invasion go this way instead of up this way? And he says, I know what I'll do. I'll start a nation. And if I'm going to start a nation, I'll need first parents to start the nation, and the the one feature that a couple would need to begin a nation would be fertility. So I'm going to pick a 75-year-old man and a 65-year-old wife who have never had a children, and I'm going to promise them to start a nation with them, and then I'm going to string them along for 25 years. And this is God's plan. Well, what is he doing? Well, he is addressing what happened in the garden, and Abraham is going to have to begin to trust and relate in a manner that is sustainable. And he gives Israel the law, and on and on and on and on and on. And so heaven and earth is being addressed. But then all of this is the question: how to defeat death. Abraham, well, the reason Abraham and Sarah are infertile is because in their infertility they embody death. And God's invasion, in a sense, says, I am going to come undo death. And what Abraham and Sarah keep trying to do is find a way around believing in the invasion from heaven. And, well, let's try Hagar and Ishmael. Let my servant be my heir. Let Lot be my heir. No. You are going to have a child, and you laugh because you don't believe me. His name is going to be laughter, because it's going to be God's joke on your imagination that you run this world. And then, of course, Jesus comes. He is the Logos made flesh. He is the one, and he then becomes, he who has no children then basically has all the children, because he is the new embodied new creation. So what in a sense you have is you have three axes. You have the z-axis for Piaget's equilibrated state. You have the x-axis, which is me and my family and my town and my city, all the way out to the world. You have the time axis, let's say that's the y-axis, which is now, and it goes to all of my descendants and goes to all of the future. And then in a sense you have the z-axis, which is we're embodied stories. It's the physical world. For the Greeks to remember Hector, well, that's the way they conquered death. Well, what would be a better way to conquer death would be to have Hector not just be the dead story, but to have Hector continue to live. It's the z-axis, or the equilibrated state. And then that is the pattern. And that, again, why, and I've said this a number of times, if there's anything that I've been more convinced of since starting the Jordan Peterson journey, it has been the necessity of the resurrection, not in a tribalistic sense to say, well, okay, this proves Christianity and validates my tribe, but much more in the sense of how it fits into the whole story. Because, again, Hector defies death because we can remember Hector. Odysseus defies death because we can remember Odysseus, but they go down to Hades, never to be heard from again, and they only live on through their story. And what happens with Jesus? Well, he in fact comes back to life, and it all has to be remapped on all the way out in terms of the equilibrated state, all the way out. That's what we're looking for. And then you have the end of the story. You have Revelation, you have new heavens and new earth, and it's the final state without chaotic disruption. There's no longer any sea, says the book of Revelation. The heavens and earth are one. See, what happens in the equilibrated state is that you know it isn't equilibrated when it bumps into something. And in another lecture where Peterson, in the 2017 lecture where Peterson is talking about Piaget, he talks about the history of scientific revolutions, that basically we go along with knowledge, we adapt, and then there's one point that we can't adapt from. It's like when Newtonian mechanics hit a wall and they don't work in very large and very small things. And so then you have your leap to quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics works until you hit something, and then you need another leap. Well, one way to envision this is revolutions, but another way to envision this is, well, you have big jumps of perfection that come in. And what happens archetypally, at the end of the story, it's the perfect world. It's heaven and earth reunited. The rebellion of earth then is put down. And all of those first fruits then come in terms of Jesus. That's why when Jonathan keeps talking about symbolism and history, they connect. They always have to connect. Now, they might not map on with the cultural representation that we expect from our culture, but it's not that they're disconnected. They're not mere myth, which is that they're just kind of floating out there in space. They must connect onto history, or they're not shamanic. They're not interesting to us. We don't relate to them. They don't give us hope. We don't see them as opportunity or threat. They don't grip us. And that's, I think that's essentially where Jonathan was going in his video. And I guess I'm just trying to say it in a different way. So let me know if this was helpful.